Thank you. Hi, everyone. I haven't included any logos of the city. It's not a city policy or position that I'm presenting. It's some research that I conducted using the seed data that Andrew constructed from SARS. And so, very colorful presentation. I know everybody's a little bit tired. It's been a long day. I was tasked with looking at the economic consequences of COVID for urban areas and what the C data contains there. And this is a very simple pie chart comparison of employment growth versus employment levels at the end point of the data. And what you will notice is that the rest of South Africa group, which is in green there, is overrepresented in terms of its employment growth relative to the urban areas. And indeed, Johannesburg is severely underrepresented, while Cape Town is more than holding its own in terms of its share of employment growth over that period. And this is a similar chart to what Professor Turok presented earlier today. It's very popular amongst our political heads to send out this chart. It shows Cape Town's doing very well in terms of employment development, both in comparison to the rest of South Africa and also to the other metros. But I wanted to look a little bit more in depth at what are potential causes and the dynamics of the employment growth here. I also found this one quite instructive. This is real median incomes over the period that the data covers. It's about a decade. It's quite a shocking graph, frankly, to look at. It's obviously adjusted by CPI, the nominal median wages, which is reported in the public data set, and the decline has been quite substantial. So I think what's clear so far is that the traditional view of urban centers driving economic growth and economic dynamism isn't really represented in the data, with maybe some exception for Cape Town. Which way am I? Sorry, I'm going back. I also looked a little bit at the demographic factors, and there's a few slides on that. What is prevalent here is that the age dynamics, if you want to call it the youth employment gap in formal employment, has been worsening for all of the provinces in the country. The Western Cape does do slightly better here, but it's gotten worse. And if you look at it from a metro perspective, the picture is even more stark with Tshwane and Johannesburg. The colors here are not exactly representing correctly, but the Gauteng metros particularly are doing poor here in the divergence between the share of employment that youth hold. And this is in absolute terms, but it displays. So when you look at this also by a gender breakdown, what emerges is a more equal labor force. We spoke a bit earlier about the inequality in unemployment rates, but it's tending towards equality here in the worst possible way, which is to say that employment opportunities for young men seems to be declining substantially, young women as well, but it extends into the 25 to 35 age bracket for men. And we'll get a little bit into the sectors involved. I'm certain some of this isn't new to anybody, so please, if you have questions, we can cover that later as well. Okay. So and here we're just covering some of the nominal income, the gender wage caps, and comparing those by age cohort. Again, as we expect, younger groups have a lower median wage, and it increases over time, and it's quite a substantial wage gap once you go over the youth bracket, which I think is relevant as well in the context of what we've just seen, that it's really the lower entry-level jobs that are falling away. And that the wage gaps really amongst the lower income groups is not as large. And so I did a comparison here of how the employment growth has looked for Johannesburg versus Cape Town over that period. A lot of what was found was really like a dynamic whereby Gauteng seems to underperform. So I wanted to look at what the different sectors look like. The size of the bubbles here are just scaled by the total FTEs. And what you tend to find is within the service sectors, Cape Town is overperforming Johannesburg. Anything above the 45-degree line here would be in Cape Town's favor in relative terms. And there are a couple of exceptions. But notably, what you'll see is construction here in the bottom left-hand corner. And we'll get to construction again in a moment because it seems to be one of the outlier sectors within Gauteng, within the formal employment data. Okay. Here we have it again. So this is a very similar chart, though I've taken the provincial level data and provided it as bar charts. And here you can see that at the provincial level, the construction sector in Gauteng has been doing particularly poorly, as has manufacturing. In the Western Cape, you've seen kind of construction peddling water, so to speak, and manufacturing slightly coming out ahead. But at the other end of the spectrum, we've got education and public administration, public sector employment, where Gauteng has effectively dominated in terms of nominal growth. Right. So I'm going to make the argument that we've seen productivity declines within the South African economy based on the data that's provided. And I've got here just this laser. Yeah. So this is just inventories as a percentage of GDP from the Reserve Bank. And what we see is kind of a stabilization of inventories in a democratic era up until about 2010, and then they start sliding off the chart again. So my conclusion would be that we haven't seen a decline in the demand for our products, but we've seen a decline in our productivity, and we've been unable to meet demand to the extent that we have prior. And I modeled that, so now we're getting to a bit of math. This is Cobb-Douglas production function. I'm certain everybody's seen that one before. And you can take some equilibrium conditions to get to a wage rate. What I'm more interested in is the rate of employment growth, so the change of labor over the labor stock. And there's a couple of predictions that the model makes. One is that it's inversely proportional to the technological shock here, or rather to the wages, and additionally that larger technological changes will have consequences for labor demand. Right, so we can kind of specify that model in the kind of log differences, OLS style, and I've created indicators for the metros, for the industries, for the year, but also for the lagged total labor demand, the wage growth rate, and the base wages. There is the risk of some simultaneity bias here in the estimation, so I've started off by doing an inclusion and exclusion of the change in median incomes. What you tend to find is that the inclusion of the shift in median incomes improves the fit of your model, and so going forward with the rest of the partial regressions, I'm sticking to that. Right? And what do we find? Negative scale effects. The larger employment sectors, and maybe I should just specify here, the nodes of comparison here are metro industry nodes at the 5-digit level of the SIC codes. So I found those to be the easiest to identify sectors, mini sectors, urban sectors, and these include all of the sectors within the SARS data set, and I've done a comparison for different age groups. And what you tend to find, like I said, is that there are negative scale effects. Larger employment groups suffer disproportionately in terms of declining labor demand. That there is wage sensitivity, but it's much higher amongst the younger cohort, as one would expect. In fact, the sensitivity here suggests an elasticity of 43%. Okay, let's go forward. And once we account for these scale factors, the urban edge, so to speak, is positive. So a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the decline of urban centers is not representative necessarily of their relative favorability for economic growth. There are more fundamental productivity factors that are driving declines in urban employment. And the urban areas still have favorable effects when controlling for these factors. Also for time dynamics and the like. And again, Cape Town is a little bit ahead, but not by much, right? On aggregate, it's basically even with Johannesburg. And while it's slightly above for certain age groups, it's about the same for the mid-age group. Here are some additional dynamics by different age groups for different sectors. The baseline here is the public administration sector. And generally what you find is negative relationships for all the other sectors, which is to say that public wages have grown, or public employment has grown at a disproportionate rate compared to the private sector. Right. So what can explain it? Partially you might say, well, Cape Town's got lower median wages, but I think there's a pertinent question given the outperformance of the public administration sector, and I'll start off just by pointing out the kind of wage distribution of employment growth within the Western Cape, which follows kind of the traditional model. I might say that it would be perfect if this bar was a little bit up here, right? We've seen a decline in employment, private sector employment below the minimum wage. We haven't seen that shift into above minimum wage employment, but overall, we have a large base of employment at a lower wage band, and it kind of tapers off as you get to the higher wage bands, and it's driven primarily by the private sector. So the private sector employment growth is greater than the public sector employment growth at all of the higher wage bands here, right? And now I'm going to show Gauteng's, which is very wonky, right? Like it doesn't look like that at all. You've got substantial growth of employment in these higher wage bands. In fact, it's crowding out, in my opinion, crowding out some of the private sector employment in those bands. And you see a hollowing out of the midpoint here, right? You do see a bit more of the transition from below minimum wage private sector to above minimum wage private sector work. But I would argue that this data point here requires additional investigation, and perhaps it's possible, I believe, with access to the data center and a structured data set to answer specifically this question, it would be possible to look into that. But with the public data set, this is what I was able to extract. I know my talk hasn't had a specific target. I've tried to cover some of the things I've uncovered in the data set, and so. I think some of the disparate outcomes in economic performance can be attributed to spatial economic sensitivity, which is also related to the size of industry in different parts of the country. And lower wages in Cape Town have likely played a role, but I believe so has the public sector hiring practices, and that would be a policy question, right? Whether you want to continue with the public sector hiring practices that promotes setting a floor for public sector employment, knowing that there is likely some competition for that part of the labor force. Yes, so that's my talk. If you have any questions, please feel free.
Thanks. I'm just thinking about your analysis. Would you be able to correlate sectors with salaries? Because when you look at the Gauteng, that drop could link to some of the declining sectors you see. So middle income, which I would put at middle income, construction workers, you see a decline in construction and that band drops quite dramatically. And then similar to Western Cape. So it could be very sectorally linked rather than anything else.
Yeah, so I did have a look at that. Generally, the construction sector employment was focused in the younger age groups and lower incomes. And additionally, the public sector employment was concentrated very heavily amongst municipal and provincial level employment as opposed to the national level there, just as a point of interest.
Thanks very much for some interesting insights. My main question is whether you've tried to kind of verify some of the findings with any other data sources. So the issues of youth employment, the decline in youth employment is clearly a very, very important issue. Have you tried to match that with the QLFS, for example, or any other source? And similarly with the low wage rates in Cape Town, it does strike one as surprising, given that house prices are the highest in the country, and right. What's going on there? Is there also any other evidence to support that? Thanks very much.
Right. So I did do some verification with the QLFS, specifically because I picked up some peculiar data points around Ekurhuleni, which I think might just be late reporting, and so I kind of censored some of that data. Then the other question was about Cape Town and the wage effects there, and whether the median wage is representative. While Cape Town does have the lowest median wage, it also has the greatest growth in the higher wage bands. And so I think really much of the property valuations can be driven by demand amongst those higher wage bands, and that much of the other aspect of it is driven by the sectoral composition of the Cape Town economy, which is significantly driven by the retail economy, where you don't really see high wages. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, to partly answer that, there is some evidence of head office effects within the data, and it's most severe in Cape Town and Joburg.
Right.
And specifically in the retail sector in Cape Town.
Yeah.
And so that is partially bringing down that median income in Cape Town.
It could be skewing the median wage just by filling up the lower wage bands with these. Yeah.
Just on that hollowing out in Johannesburg, it's a pity the SARS data doesn't have occupations, because that's completely consistent with the polarization of the labor market, where automation hollows out middle jobs.
Right.
And where you see an increase in the upper tail and an increase in the bottom tail, but a hollowing out to the middle.
Right.
So that could be one explanation for that.
So yes, I think that there's likely multiple explanations for what's happening in the private sector in Johannesburg, and it's not purely driven by the public sector, but we do also see that some of the service sector employment has declined in those same wage bands, and so I'm not certain it's purely an automation factor. It's not purely the manufacturing sector that's driving it. Yeah, I think it really requires focused analysis and a carefully constructed data set to answer that very question. Yeah.
So this is the SARS panel, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm kind of curious about our ability to trust this sort of below minimum wage and data. Right. So, Haroon's done some work that suggests that nobody pays it. So I presume that these people are just they're falling off the books,
Yeah.
right? So I don't know that I want you to make too much of that, right?
No.
But I'm just kind of curious how much we think we believe that kind of information in the SARS data, because I have no idea.
Yeah, so it's a valid argument that likely what we're seeing in Cape Town is people just being taken off the books and continually employed at below minimum wage. I think it's a curiosity that the minimum wage does not seem to be binding at all, and really that's true even in the public sector. Maybe people are scared of getting caught, and maybe the evidence suggests they shouldn't be, right? That there's really not much consequence. But I do take your point that that shifts in below minimum wage employment are not really necessarily indicative of much. They might just be scared. Right?
Kristoff, just for interest sake, what's next? Obviously, you've been working on this for a long time, so what's next, and does that include incorporating the export data? Will you be linking that up and seeing the impact that might have on employment creation and whatever, GVA, etc.?
So maybe I should pose this question to Paul, because he kind of gives me some guidance on what there's demand for within the city. When I did this, I obviously, it was one of the first data sets I was presented when I joined the city about 3 years ago, the SARS data set, and I am very familiar with it. And so when I was given the task to kind of investigate what had happened, there's lots of questions I wanted to answer, and I'm certain you've noticed that it's quite a broad set of things we tried to cover today. Whether I will continue with this particular stream of research, it'll be demand dependent internally. Though I'm open if people would like to propose that I do more research like this. I'm certain we can take it to the city. Right now I'm working on the Airbnb economy, so that's in a different direction. But yeah, I should have maybe posted my email address, but I'm open to being included in additional research in this direction.
So that I find your final answer quite interesting. That this was essentially a work it was for as part of your job at the City of Cape Town, right? So
Yes.
what, just for interest sake, in terms of bringing good research to policy, how did the City of Cape Town use it? Like how are they using? How are they? I mean, and Paul can answer that too. I mean, that's fine.
That's it's a difficult question for me to answer.
Yeah, so if I can come in now. So I mean, so we haven't used SARS data once off. This is a particular bit of analysis that Kristoff did, and he also did want to present it in this forum. I think, I mean, we started with what impact has COVID had and how has that changed, how industries have sort of morphed in that. But like a good economist, Kristoff followed the more interesting angle, which he found in this. But I mean, we've used SARS data in a variety of other ways as well. I mean, even something as unusual as trying to work out the determinants of copper theft and understand how the proximity of a scrapyard to a copper theft incidence would increase the probability of copper theft. So that we use SARS data to try and identify scrapyard. So that's really unusual. But Kristoff's done stuff on trying to understand industries in Atlantis. That's a nice easy one because it's so geographically isolated, so it's not likely to have too much postal code error or kind of headquarter effect. And we've done a range of different spatial analyses as well. So we see it as an ongoing resource, and this type of analysis we continually use. Yeah.
I think, from my perspective, there is a takeaway for the municipal economy here, and it is that when you enter the labor market as a municipality or a provincial government, you have to be careful about the depth of the labor pool that you're going into, and that you could potentially crowd out the private sector if you're too active. I say that more as a precaution because it doesn't seem from the data that it's currently happening within the Western Cape. But I do think it's something, it's a valid question. And it's one, there's a lot of discussion about public sector wages. There's a lot less discussion about what are the, there's questions about the fiscal implications of public sector wages, but there aren't sufficient questions about the impact on the private sector of the public sector being as large as it is, and our availability of skilled labor being a potential bottleneck to private sector growth.
I think you're posing an interesting question, but it's not just about the wages, right? I'm saying it's also about all the other benefits of public sector employment.
Right.
The security,
Yeah.
the other benefits of pension and
Yeah.
so on. But security particularly, right?
Right.
It's
Yeah.
hard to get fired.
Absolutely.
So this must be massive, and not just a Gauteng issue. I'm sure
Yeah.
it's an issue across the country.
No, I think there is a good question about the intensity of it. Because I was looking primarily at urban economies, I tried to focus on Gauteng and the Western Cape, where I know in the Western Cape, the city is 70% of the economy. Gauteng is a primarily urban economy. It's arguably a very difficult question to even broach because of what you're mentioning and the political sensitivity of talking about austerity measures within the public sector or downsizing the public sector. I don't think we're likely to move backwards in that way, but perhaps more care can be taken in terms of in which areas we expand the public sector and how we proceed, right? But yes, I do take your point that public sector employment yields a certain amount of job security to people, and that also means that there's less, as I would say, entropy within the labor market of people shifting between jobs. I think really it is a very fruitful question to ask the data, but it would require the data to be structured in order to answer it. Yeah. That does it confirm that the transition. Right. Yeah. So that would be supportive of my conclusion there.